to children in underserved communities, and perhaps even more importantly, or equally important, mentoring surgeons throughout the country. And that includes me. Ed, I look forward to you helping us out to learn about new horizons in surgery.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that nice introduction. Good morning, everyone. I am absolutely excited to be with you. I have to tell you that coming to Mackinac has been on my bucket list for a good part of my life. I grew up in a really small house in Virginia, and in our basement, my mother had a picture of the Grand Hotel, and she never had a chance to come here. But she said, one day, if you come, remember me. So I hope my mother is here, and I'm sure she is smiling. I wish, before beginning my talk, to pay homage to the indigenous people who inhabited this land 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, and their descendants. I honor them and pay homage to them, and as you probably know from some of the historical literature, they were primarily the tribes listed on top, I won't pronounce their names, of the major group that is listed below, of the larger Algonquin community. And these are very interesting indigenous people because they feel that they were created by divine breath and that they follow a path of righteousness and goodness. And so how appropriate that this meeting would be held in this space. And so I wish to honor them, and they were considered good humans, as you are. I bring you warm greetings from Cleveland, Ohio, and clearly warm greetings. It was 90 there when we left yesterday, and it was frigid here when we got here. As you know, I'm at University Hospitals, and I work for Dr. Harridge, and I see several of my good friends here. I will be brief, but as much as I honor the indigenous people here, it is also important to honor those people who were either founders or people who kept the ship afloat in tough times. And as many of you know, Dr. William Hunter Harridge was a man of uncommon valor, dignity, and integrity, who, when this organization went through tough times, helped keep it above ground. He also was a part of America's greatest generation and was injured in World War II, allowing us to celebrate in beautiful places like this. So this is a man who I suspect that many of you, especially those with gray hair, will know. This is William Halsted. And Halsted felt in the training of surgeons that there was no other place other than the laboratories of the wards and the laboratories of the highest order to train surgeons. And that in order to move forward in surgical science, we should stay within those boundaries or those borders. This is the Halstedian model that we have been trained in, and there are people like me. I don't know if anyone can pick me out there. Standing on the Bullfinch lawn in a kind of classic MGH picture from 31 years ago when I finished my surgery training at the MGH to go on to be the first African-American super chief resident. And I had a phenomenal time at the MGH, but I was very much brought up in this model of Halsted. And that model is that I was a visiting scientist at Biogen. I did molecular biology there. When I finished my training and started in Pittsburgh, I made tumor vaccines studying the immunobiology of neuroblastoma. I was a tenured professor. I did all those things, started the first shortcut program for children with transplant in the world, but followed along this guideline of staying within the boundaries of the laboratory and the hospital. And that was great until I came to Cleveland. And when I came to Cleveland, I recognized that I needed to be a part of a much bigger, a much broader community. And as my mentor and at times sponsor, LD Britt says that, and I believe that surgeons need to fulfill their responsibilities to the greater society. And that whether we're in the house of surgery or village of surgery, we have an unbreakable contract. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that unbreakable contract as we think about working beyond the boundaries. And I'd like to have you think about whether there's a new horizon for surgery, not an alternative, but a new horizon for surgery. Ambitious agenda for the next 25 minutes. I'll just leave these here. But I in effect, want to talk about socially responsible surgery. I want to challenge you to rethink how you see yourself as a surgeon and explore opportunities to collaborate. What a crazy 2.5 years we've had. It's been mind-blowing with the virus. And whether it's the changes in the stock market, the racial reckoning that has occurred in this country, the tremendous great resignation, especially the loss of women in the workplace, the social divide that has occurred in our country, or such things as climate change. We have been put in a space in which we are challenged to see ourselves again. And in fact, we are much like Malcolm Gladwell spoke, we are at a tipping point when small things make a very big difference. The pandemic certainly laid bare the systemic inequities that exist in this country across many domains, whether it's along race and its ethnicity, social class, or gender identity. We have seen changes, or we have been brought to bear issues related to ethnicity and disparity in this country. And by and large, for many years, I think we as surgeons felt that we may be immune to this, but there is a poster in the back, I think from the Cleveland Clinic, looking at colorectal cancer that points out some of the inequities that exist. And whether it is in the access to minimally invasive surgery, the late-stage presentation of malignancy, or the in-house mortality, or whether there are issues related to socioeconomic status, as you see here, or gender identity, gender preference, we have systemic structural challenges that I think we as surgeons are almost uniquely positioned to address, and should not necessarily be left in the hands of primary care physicians. You guys are familiar with this slide. These are the various domains outside the hospital that affect health outcomes. And you understand health outcomes: premature death, disability, and disease. And for me, after being in Cleveland working with children, there's a fourth outcome, which I call despair, which has a tremendous impact. And these have come to be called by the CDC the social determinants of health: where we're born, where we live, where we work, where we play, and where we age. And these cross a variety of domains that some of us might look at and say, this is beyond our scope of impact. But I would argue that I think even those of us who spend 80 hours a week in the hospital have an opportunity in a small way to make an impact. And as you know, we focus on outcomes now as surgeons, and we have an opportunity, if we can modify some of these, to work up to a 70% decrease in mortality. So this came out at the American at the American Surgical a few years ago. I was actually sitting next to Dr. Pollack at that meeting when this paper was presented. And this crosses every domain. I think everyone in this room is inspired to do good for their patients. So I was sitting, maybe I can admit this, in a bar at the Four Seasons in Philadelphia there in 2006, getting ready to give the boards, and I saw my good friend, my medical student when I was a resident, Paul Farmer, and I was lamenting to Paul that I no longer got funding for my lab that studied neuroblastoma. And Paul, in his curious way, he said, well, Ed, you got to think beyond the borders and think beyond the boundaries. And he said, you know, the challenge is that we're focusing so much on molecular disease that in some ways what we've done is we're forgetting to look at the biosocial understandings of medical phenomena that are urgently needed. Little did I know when he was telling me that he was quoting himself from something that he had just written. But this, I think, is what we should be called to, is to think about different perches that we can stand on in order to have impact. So I'd like you to do what Adam Grant says, is I'd like you to think again or rethink who we are as surgeons. Who are we? Do we have a social responsibility? And I make that really specific for us, not just physicians, but do we have a social responsibility? And what that responsibility means is it's the duty to improve the health of our communities and our society through actions that we pursue in order to eliminate some of the structural barriers that limit our patients. And I have a list of things that are here, and you don't have to think about doing all of them, but small steps are critically important. Well, there is a strong chorus that says, hey, Ed. We should just kind of stay in our lanes. We should focus on improving our technical ability. We should focus on ensuring our hospital system is good, and that the medical profession should resist any efforts to be advocates. And I think that maybe that's okay. It's not particularly how I see things, but I grant the grace that you can see that in different ways. And that I think that's okay. But I would challenge all of us in the room that we at least should vote. We should at least have our voice for our opinion, whether it's right or left, red or blue. We need to step forward for those things that will impact the way we are. But I'm here to tell you today that I want to challenge you. I want to call to action both you individually and corporately to think about being a surgeon as an advocate. Now, I know it's kind of out of the comfort zone for some, but when I look around the room and I look at the young energy that's here, I think that there's opportunity for us to begin, if we can't completely pass the torch to the next generation, that we can give them a platform where they can move forward in this regard. Pardon me. This is not a new concept of physician as advocate, and in fact, Rudolf Virchow in the mid-1800s described medicine itself as a social science. And what Dr. Virchow felt is that physicians were the natural attorneys of the poor. Well, I never want to be compared with an attorney, but I think if you substitute the word advocate there, I think it sounds a lot better. But in general, when you think about what we do, and when I look at some of my colleagues here who work in the so-called safety net hospitals, they truly see and understand these issues more than the rest of us. So what is advocacy? What does it really mean? Well, here's the AMA's definition, and I won't be sophomoric or overly pedantic by reading it, but it's an opportunity for us to think beyond the hospital and the operating room. And so how can we be advocates? We can do some of the things that are listed here. And one of the things that I like most is this concept of collaboration or building support, working across domains, working across other fields to ally yourself with people who have different skill sets, but views that may advance the important missions that improve the quality of life for our patients and their care. Because what we recognize is that these social determinants of health are occurring before our patients get to the hospital and after they go home. And that's what's impacting care. And they are modifiable and they are actionable. And so again, the course is, let's just stay in our lane. And I like this young surgeon who I actually had an opportunity to meet. I didn't know she was interested in pediatric surgery when I gave my presidential address. This is Heather Levy, and Heather did this multi-institutional study in which she looked at the surgeon's role in social justice advocacy. And this is published in the American Journal of Surgery and came out earlier this year. Anonymous survey. She looked at 3 academic medical centers, and she found of the 123 respondents who were junior faculty that 46% 72% who responded said yes, they feel that there is a role for advocacy. And interestingly enough, there was a gender difference in those faculty who were involved in advocacy, with the female faculty being much more involved in these. And I find that very interesting because it tells us about the energy to affect change in the realm of social justice. She also looked in her paper, which I recommend to those of you who may be geared in this regard, at why people choose not to be involved in advocacy, and I honor this as well. It's their choice. They don't want to do it. Some worry that it's not professional, that it might alienate their patients and inhibit relationships that they have within their hospital if they take a stand on certain issues. I think, though, the way our times are going, we are being pushed to make a stand. You know, there is always a not-so-humble brag when a surgeon speaks, so I'm going to do a little not-so-humble brag. This is Dr. Ayla Stanford. Dr. Ayla Stanford is a pediatric surgeon. When COVID hit Philadelphia, she tested and vaccinated more people than the city of Philadelphia in the first year. She abandoned her practice. She's on CNN often. She was named Forbes magazine top 50, over 50, and she was the runner-up for the CNN Hero. And I'm proud to say that Ayla is like my little daughter of sorts, or maybe that's, but anyway, I have mentored and sponsored her for 20 years, particularly along this issue. And Ayla brings, if you know her, she brings high energy to the table. And I look in this audience and see high energy, and someone saying, you know, what makes a pediatric surgeon want to go stick a swab up someone's nose? She grew up in Philadelphia, and this pandemic was impacting the neighborhood and the city that she grew up and loved, and so she left her practice for a while to do what was the thing to do. So I would argue that those of us who have kind of casually been doing this training in activism and advocacy, I would argue that this should be incorporated, should be considered to be incorporated in the residency training programs around the country. And there are some models, so this isn't something that has to be created. This is something that exists and occurs now at BU with Tracy Deckard. And there are models online, there's a CARES curriculum, but her program has both advocacy, education, research, and service, and is having tremendous impact, ripple effects in the way things are being seen and done. And so that's my statement about advocacy. I'd like to move a little bit into the work that we're doing, the specific work that we're doing, and I'll try to move through this really quickly. There's some data here that I'm going to gloss through for the sake of time. Never in my life would I imagine in an audience like this that I would be talking about violence. I was a cancer surgeon for kids. I did short gut syndrome. We developed the largest database and program in the world for children with 500 people from all over the world. But cancer, as you know, is a major public health issue, and unless you're living under a rock, it is taking a tremendous toll on our country, whether it's in mass shootings or whether it's on street corners. And in fact, the incidence of violence just in 2020 was up 47%. And at Rainbow, 2020 was the highest year for children, gunshot wounds in children with about 75. 80 in 2021, we are already at 95 gunshot wounds in children ages 6 to 15. And so something is not quite right, and so something needs to be done. And I think this fits the pattern of what we call a syndemic. A syndemic is when two epidemics or pandemics coexist, and the presence of those two coexisting epidemics accentuates each other. And certainly on the east side of Cleveland, and I think on the west side of Cleveland, we are seeing the impact of these synergistic epidemics. Well, this is what we saw in the New England Journal in April of this year. I think this is a very important slide, especially for those of us in pediatric surgery, but I think those of us in public health. You will see the tremendous decrease in the loss of life of children from automobile accidents, but the increase in children lost to gunfire. And so what this shows is that in 2019, there was a crossover point in which now and you see the steep curve, there are more people dying from gunshot wounds than automobile accidents in the United States. So in 2007, I came to Cleveland for my dream job, absolutely my dream job, chief of surgery at a major children's hospital. And that dream was shattered by a bullet. Little did I know that the city that I was coming to, out of no disrespect, was a city that suffered heavily under the weights of the social determinants, especially for children. Highest child poverty rate, highest infant mortality rate, and the highest suicide rate in the public school system. Many of these things are things that we can have impact on. So it's clear who I am, African-American male who grew up in a working class community. My first patient there looked like my son, and I took care of him August 9th, 2007. He came in dead and he left dead. He was in the wrong neighborhood visiting his aunt, and he was shot because he lacked what they call a hood pass. It was really tough for me because I saw him, I saw my son, I saw his mother, I saw my wife, and I thought about all the lost years of potential. His mother has given me permission to use the story and his image to talk about him, and in fact, 2 years later at my endowed chair ceremony, she showed up uninvited, unannounced, and gave a drop the mic presentation, which changed the way my children see medicine. And in fact, my oldest son, who's 29, who looks like Brandon, is doing orthopedic surgery at Wash U, and I have another son in the Pike to go to medical school. But as much as I tried to tightrope my way back from these social factors toward academic medicine, they kept growing and pulling me back into the fray. And my academic medicine changed. And out of a sense of outrage of seeing this wanton violence, I stormed into the office of the president of the hospital in Rainbow and told him, "What are you doing about this?" And he looked at me and he said, "What are you doing about this?" And so 2 weeks later, I met with the mayor and the chief of the police in Pittsburgh, and I decided that if I wanted to have impact, I had to treat this like I treated a laboratory problem. I had to get close to it. I had to get proximity, much as Brian Stevenson says. And so the chief of the police in Pittsburgh and the mayor at that time we established a program, Operation Focus. And this is something I've never done. I went in jeans and rolled up shirt onto street corners, into crack dens, juvenile detention center, a variety of places that I would never think that I'd go. And I got a chance to get close to the problem and understand what was motivating this scourge of violence. And we established a tough love program, and lo and behold, 2 years later, we had the lowest rate of murders in Cleveland. And we were able to parlay that into a $2 million grant from the Fed. There's Eric Holder coming to Cleveland to give us the $2 million. There's Steve Dettelbach, the new head of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. And lo and behold, when the money ran out, the violence rate went sky high again. But what I learned in that process is going into homes and drug dens and just chatting with kids and people who look like me 40 to 50 years earlier, I began to understand the roots of violence, and I began to understand that in many ways, those of us in medicine are taking care of the downstream factors. So if someone gets shot, they come in, we give great care, but we treat them and treat them. We're not looking at how we can move upstream to impact things. We also allied with people in public health to look at the distribution of violence in Cleveland, and we began to see that this violence distribution closely correlated with the old redline mapping. You know what redlining is, old redlining mapping of Cleveland. And I got this idea because many of my patients who were born prematurely, who were shot, they would have grandmothers who were younger than I am, in their 40s and 50s, already with AV fistulas from end-stage renal disease. But the devastating part for me in going into schools is meeting children and recognizing that in some neighborhoods in Cleveland, there were no children there. And they talked to me about the term LIFE. I thought that was life. They would say living in fear every day. and that living long meant living to be 25. And I recognized that many of them had seen things or witnessed things that impacted not only their perspective, but also their physiology. And that in impacting that, the body keeps score. And that impact on health goes long term. So I realized the link between violence and health, and we wanted to do something about it. We wanted to study it. And so I recognized that we had to think in a kind of organized way about structure. And as this quote says from Robert Kennedy, that he spoke in Cleveland the day after Martin Luther King was killed, this is the whole concept of structural violence. I'm moving quickly now. And I kind of witnessed, these are 3 of my patients in 10 days, 4 of them. That young man survived, but these 3 died. And this young woman, there's a serial podcast that talks about her, and I realized forever I can't look at a lion anymore, because that was the size of the 6-month-old heart when she was just shot and killed, waiting for her mother to get birthday candles. So we collaborated with the Mandel School of Public Health, or Urban Public Health and Urban Poverty, to do a systematic look at violence in our part of Cleveland. So sorry, going to get through the data and get through the talk, but they have what's called a longitudinal integrated data system that has every child born in Cuyahoga County from 1989, 250 million entries across 35 domains that you see here. So they can develop a picture, a socioeconomic, a social demographic picture of almost every child. And what we did is we looked at our data for violence. So in a 1-year period of time, we see 450 children, this was then, who are victims of violence. Of that, there are about 70 that are gunshot wounds, 358 who have been assaulted. And we wanted to look at who they were, how they were, and what we could do. These are children between the 4th and 10th grade, and we compared them with 20,000 age-matched, neighborhood-matched controls to see if we could determine any distinct patterns of them. This is what we studied. We studied the gunshot wounds, we studied the stabbings and assaults, and we found a difference in both of those populations. And our paper is published, and you can read the details. And what we found is that the kids who were violently injured were more likely to be born prematurely, more likely to be on public assistance, more likely to be involved with child welfare at an earlier age, have housing insecurity, and chronic absenteeism and truism. So that probably doesn't surprise you, but it was significant, and it was more significant for the kids who had been shot as opposed to the kids who had been stabbed. And these are all kids from the same neighborhood. And so what this painted a picture for us is the ecosystem, or the environment around which children are raised. And from a developmental person, pediatric person, we realized that we need to put efforts into the home environment between 0 and 5. So instead of focusing on gun control, we focus on the victim. And so I'll close by talking to you about our program. There was a medical student who heard me give a version of this talk in Los Angeles in 2014, and the crazy student decided he wanted to come to medical school at Case so we could put something together. Well, that was $4 million ago. We wrote a program designed to help provide wraparound services for children. And what I recognized when I went to the community is this quote, and I never understood, that hurt people hurt people. And as I pondered that, once I understood that, it helped me change the language around violence in my mind. And I saw these as hurt people who were injured and healing despite their circumstance. And it gave me more grace. And as healers, which we are, I recognize that if hurt people, Healed people can heal people, and we can do it out of the operating room. So instead of doing the downstream things of pulling people out of the water, out of the streets being shot, we began to move upstream, and we wanted to do policy-related things. And by investing upstream, we developed this program. This is our baby, the Anti-Fragility Initiative. It's built on a business concept that when things are broken and put back together, businesses, they're actually more strong after chaos. And so I used the concepts of human-centered design that I'd learned in a course at Stanford. And so I took all my notes from all the work we'd done in the community, the empathy I'd built, we defined the problem, we created an idea, we made a prototype, and we're continuously testing it. This is the anti-fragility concept, and it's based on this art form known as kintsugi, which some of you may be familiar with. The broken vessel repaired with gold is more valuable than it was before it was broken. These are our core values: community, equity, prevention, opportunity, and care. And this is how we do our program. I'll show you that in a sec. Our specific aims are to keep people from being re-victimized or retaliating. We want to limit the social determinants and the toxic stress. We want to improve their aspirations, and we want to create a trauma-informed hospital environment so that we can create post-traumatic growth for our population of children. It begins this way. At Rainbow, we see children 6 to 15 years of age who've been injured. And can you imagine we have a 7-year-old who's been shot 3 times in 2 years? Our recidivism, our re-injury rate is 30% in this population. Our depression and suicide rate is also 30%. We're a 12-month holistic program, and I'll show you just how we do it. We think that when the most macho of kid is shot and comes in, that we have a teachable moment in that period of time when they see the white light or they're worried, that we can kind of get into their mindset and help them change, not all of them. We take care of them in the hospital, and we're in their home within 48 hours to create a program that is strength-based. It is holistic. We want to know how they're doing in school, what their identity is, and what are the things they aspire to do. And we have a group of collaborators that allows us to invest in them and allows us to move forward. When we first presented this program to the hospital leadership, they said, this is a waste of your time. It's never going to get funded. I had a chance to personally meet Mike DeWine at an event, and I was trying to describe the program. He said, I have no time for you. I kept walking. He said, doctor, I told you I have no time for you. And then his security people came in. I kept talking. And then 45 minutes later, he said, can I call you? If you get this on paper, we'll fund it. And the first round of funding that we got 4 years ago was for just under $700,000, and we've been able to renew that over the years. This has all resulted, most recently, in an invitation from Joe Biden to come to the White House, to the Rose Garden for the Safer Communities Act, and some of the rest is a bit of history. So as I close, I ask you to ponder this concept of staying in your lane. And I'd like you to realize that humanity is our highway, and that there are multiple lanes for us to get to the horizon. And that as we rethink, as Adam Grant says, as we rethink who we are, we're often going to be able to kind of make a difference beyond what we think. And for those of you who need tangible things, these are the things that I might suggest that you can lean in with intention, you can innovate to design a program, you can educate yourself or your residents or others, you can collaborate. Collaboration is really a big thing for me. I think that surgeons are bring naturally things to the table that others don't. We can build infrastructure, as some of you in this room have done already in this realm, and I think importantly, we can establish rigor that allows us to publish and bring things forward. So I close by saying I started out by creating this dichotomy between Halstead and L.D. Britt, but I'm not sure there's a dichotomy. So Dr. Halstead wanted to create surgeons of the highest type who would stimulate the finest youth of the country to study surgery and to devote their energies and their lives to the raising the standards of surgical science. I think we do that through activism, advocacy, and leadership, particularly for the younger in the group. And I do believe that we have an unbreakable contract with society, and that we as surgeons have always been leaders in the community. And I think that if we embrace a new vision for ourselves, if we extend beyond the boundaries, we can do this. I'd like to leave you with the concept that this talk is not solely against disease, but it's for justice. I so appreciate the opportunity to go over. Thank you so much, and this is great to learn. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Just stay right here at 1 second. So, Dr. Barksdale, that was phenomenal. And I mean, I learned a lot about you today that I didn't know about. My experience with you is all your time in Cleveland.
Yeah.
I did not know a lot about your time in Pittsburgh. But we really appreciate the wisdom that you've given to us. And this is a little memoriam of your Harridge lecture here at the Midwest Surgical.
Great.
Thanks so much.
My mother's smiling.
All right, that's great. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, folks, thanks for a great first half of the first day. Enjoy your afternoons, and we'll see you on the porch. It looks like the weather's going to hold out. Have a great afternoon.